I usually make furniture, so I'm always looking for new ways to make my pieces interesting. I recently came across this cool concept of weaving together different wood species that's frequently used in these really artistic cutting boards, and it got me thinking if there's a way to do it that makes it look more like a live edge that could be cool to use in furniture. However, I found that I needed to do it differently. So in this video, I want to show a technique that I'm planning to use in my next custom furniture build. I'm going to use a nice chunk of clear walnut as the base material, and this edge grain offcut of curly maple that should show up nice and shiny in the middle. Weaving multiple different wood species together in a single board has been done before, but not like this. I'm going to do two things differently in this approach. For one, I'm not going to use what's called the stack two boards and cut on the bandsaw at the same time technique that a lot of other videos have already covered. And I'll tell you why in a minute. I'm also not going to form my weave from multiple subtle smooth curves. Rather, I want the contrasting wood I'm going to weave in to be an organic shape that almost makes you think of a live edge. So here's a drawing of what I'm after. I'm going to refer to this maple chunk throughout the video as the lake, since both ends are contained within the walnut landmass. And this design is purposeful because when I use this technique in my upcoming build, I don't want to be able to see any contrasting colored end grain. I chose this method instead of the stacking approach because I want to carefully plan out the shapes I want on each side of the lake and ensure they overlap at the ends the way I want them to. And I worried that this would be much more difficult with the stacking method because you can't really see where the blade is cutting on the bottom board. The other reason is that it's much more difficult to cut tighter and more organic curves like I've designed smoothly on the bandsaw. Doing it this way lets me get those curves right before cutting into my actual material and trust that I can replicate those exact lines with template routing. In short, the stacking method is faster, but this method gives you more control. So to get started, I've just drawn out the curve I want on a piece of plywood. All that's really important to keep in mind when designing this is to make sure that both ends swing back towards what will be the middle of the lake a bit, and not draw anything with a radius that is so tight that you can't cut it smoothly with the bandsaw. And that's because in the end, you're going to need both sides of the cut to use as templates, which I'll call template 1A and 1B. Now, it's very unlikely that if you're using a bandsaw blade narrow enough to make this kind of cut that you aren't going to have any bandsaw marks. So just clamp it up and carefully sand away the bandsaw marks. Again, be really careful not to change the shape of either template 1A or 1B. When the sanding's all done, the templates should match up pretty tightly like this. Okay, with the templates made, it's time to mark out the shape of template 1A on the walnut board and template 1B onto the maple lake blank. In this case, the marker actually helps identify sort of a safety zone when cutting because it will give you an automatic ideal amount of material to plan on cutting away with the flush trim bit and router. When cutting these out on the bandsaw, it's important to remember that you don't have to cut this smoothly or directly on the line. I'm going to be using a router table and a huge flush trim bit on a low RPM that can remove a ton of material at a time, so I have no problem leaving a little bit more meat on the workpiece instead of trying to cut it really close and risking cutting into the part itself by going across my marker line. If you've watched a fair amount of woodworking content, you're probably familiar with the woodworker obsession with double-sided pressure-activated tape. We all have our favorite brand, and this one is mine. It's thin and really strong, but it's also sold by a fantastic small business retailer that I enjoy supporting. So if you're in need of a roll, I'll leave a link to this tape and some other great tools I use every day in my shop from TOOLWORKS in the description where you can pick some up for your shop. Now, one really valuable thing I've learned recently about template routing is that it really helps when routing templates like this to intentionally make the template longer than the workpiece, which helps guide the bearing off the workpiece without allowing it to slip around to the end grain and either round off the corner or worse, kick back on you. An even better method, which I didn't do here, is to place scrap blocks at the infeed and outfeed ends of the workpiece, which can help prevent tear out. With the first round of template routing knocked out, the first dry fit is looking pretty encouraging. No visible gaps right now, and if there are any minute gaps, the small amount of glue we'll add should make it really hard to see any imperfections. On projects like this, I really like using this glue spreader. There's no Amazon link for it, but most people have at least one in their shop already. The best part is when the glue dries and you get to peel it off later on. While that's gluing up, it's time to create templates 2A and B. To get this right, we'll need a reference point for what the opposite line already looks like so we can make the curve for the second side of the lake complement it nicely. So I'm just tracing out template 1B again here. Then we'll just sketch out the new line to our liking and outline it in marker again. The most important criteria for this line is that it curves back toward the template 1B line and crosses over it slightly at either end. This is how we'll encapsulate the lake in walnut and cover up the end grain seamlessly. Once again, we'll just carefully cut it out on the bandsaw, again, prioritizing smoothness over following the line. A little more sanding, but this time I had the idea that it might make for an even smoother template line if I added some masking tape over the edge. This could also make up a little bit for the small amount of material lost in the bandsaw kerf. After planing up the initial glue up, it looks cool enough that if we were just making a cutting board, we could stop here. But I'm confident it's going to look even cooler if we turn it into a curly maple lake instead of a curly maple beachfront. So let's keep going. Now, you can probably tell just from my body language here, I'm starting to get confused. And yes, that means a mistake is coming. And embarrassingly enough, I just now realized what my actual mistake was even after fixing it. I'll come back to this and explain what went wrong in a minute, but I'll tell you now, it happens right here. Let me know in a comment if you can spot it. For now, I'll tell you what I was initially thinking in terms of the steps I took. 1. Place template 2B onto the walnut and measure the amount I need to cut. 2. Cut a chunk of walnut away on the table saw so that we can use it on the other side with template 2B. 3. Trace template 2B onto the walnut chunk we just cut. 4. Cut out the template lines on the bandsaw for both parts. And 5. Template route the remaining waste on the router table. And it's about right here you can see me slowly realize what I've done after routing the template 2A side.
Oh no.
I fiddled with it until realizing that I somehow routed the same shape onto both parts and that they just weren't going to fit together. So let's go back and observe my mistake in the making. Okay, so you can actually tell right here, and I've actually swapped which template I should be using for which side. I should technically have marked out this line with template 2B since this section is the keeper part. And I should have cut a bigger section of the walnut away and template routed it with 2A. I know that may be a bit confusing, but my point is that it's easy to get these templates confused, and it's a good idea to use labels or markers of some kind on both the templates and workpieces to keep it all straight. Now let's jump back to the present and get this thing fixed up. I had to go ahead and template route the other side. Then, since I really needed to get back whatever part of this walnut I could, I glued the square edges together using the template and the offcut from the maple lake as clamping cauls. When that was dry, I used my straight rip jig to safely cut off the opposite curvy surface. And I'll just mention briefly, if you don't have one of these, it's really worth it to make one, which is pretty easy and inexpensive if you have a jig hardware kit. I decided to go ahead and grab about as much of the walnut as I could from the other side so I can make the final matching piece on the other side of the curly maple lake. This time, I laid the main workpiece right next to my template to help me visualize things and set up the template to cut away the bare minimum necessary from the walnut when marking my line. Off camera, I cut it out on the bandsaw and template routed it, and now it fits pretty nicely. I cut it back to square, chopping off way too much walnut in the process for some reason, and finally glued it up. Then it was just a matter of applying a few finishing touches. Cut the ends square on the miter saw, hand plane the long edges square and smooth, round the corners with these cool little corner flush trim templates, give everything a nice round over, and since I don't know what I'm actually going to do with this, finish it with my favorite food safe finish, 100% pure tung oil. I love how this turned out. I'm impressed with how great the technique worked and feel confident going into this next build that it's going to work and look really awesome in the piece I'm going to make. And if you don't want to miss that build, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.